Extreme weather hampering flood evacuation and relief efforts for isolated communities in WA's Kimberley region.
People experience wild weather at this time of year, but we've not seen anything like this before in the Kimberley.
An Australian woman charged over travelling to Islamic State territory granted bail. The US House of Representatives adjourned. Republicans failed to elect a speaker for a third straight day. And explosive allegations from Prince Harry's memoir sure to rock the royal family. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Dan Borscher. Efforts to evacuate remote, isolated Indigenous communities in WA's Kimberley region are being hampered by more wild weather, with the north of the state enduring what's believed to be its worst flooding in history. There's so much water that the Fitzroy River is now expected to spread to 50 kilometres wide across its floodplains. An ADF plane that was supposed to land in Broome is still stuck 600 kilometres away in Port Hedland after failing to get permission to land. Attention is now turning to those communities downstream from Fitzroy Crossing. The flooding has forced the closure of a 700-kilometre section of the Great Northern Highway between Broome and Halls Creek. That's isolated communities such as Derby. An evacuation mission is underway to take Nookambah residents to safety, and residents have expressed frustration over the lack of communication and of supplies.
We've not seen anything like this before, 1 in 100 year flood event. It has been very challenging because of the winds, because of the fact ex-tropical cyclone Ellie has hung around Fitzroy Crossing for days. There are some frustrations on the ground, I understand that. People have been stuck there for a few days now, but certainly there's more food. There's food in the community, there's fuel in the community, and there's more on the way today and tomorrow.
For more on this, let's bring in Melissa Price, the federal member for the electorate of Durack, which covers the Kimberley. Thanks for joining us. I understand that you're in Geraldton. What's the situation there?
Well, it's fairly typical weather for Geraldton at this time of the year. It's been very hot and very windy, but this morning we had, it was overcast with a bit of drizzle, but we're not being necessarily impacted by what's happening up in the Kimberley.
And what's your assessment of the impact that is happening across the Kimberley that we've been hearing this morning from some political leaders is perhaps the worst on record?
Well, there's no doubt that when the river rises, more than 15 metres, that you've got problems, and you saw that in your footage that you were showing earlier today, that there is a lot of water there, and people have been stranded. But what a wonderful community they have been, the Fitzroy River and Crossing and the broader community working together to rescue one another. And of course there has been some criticism of DFARS and other agencies not getting on the ground quick enough. I think the biggest criticism was what people didn't understand what was about to happen to them, and that's a fair criticism, but also not knowing what's going to happen next. But since then we've had more DFARS on the ground, and if, as you noted, we've got ADF services trying to get into the community, and I know from past experience that once you get men and women in an ADF uniform on the ground, that people start to feel much more hope and, of course, incredible resources that the ADF will bring. But the issue is not just in the Fitzroy. There are those communities within the Fitzroy River catchment area, some 47 odd communities, and they don't have great infrastructure, they don't have great communication levels, and for some of them they'll be starting to worry about their food levels. But I have full faith in the state government and also the federal government agencies to do what they need to do. But what we do need to understand as a starting point is that these communities are different to other communities that perhaps we might have seen impacted by floods on the east coast. It's an incredibly remote part of Western Australia, and we have a lot of very, very vulnerable people living in these communities already. And this is my message that I'll be delivering to the federal government and communicating with Minister Watts, who's been very available, and I very much appreciate that, is that these people, my community, English is not their first language, and for many of them there's already crowding in homes. So there's a number of things that we'll need to do very quickly, and we can't wait until the water recedes to start the planning. So what are we going to do about the bridges that are down, the road infrastructure and housing? And we need to make sure we've got dongers ready to go. I saw this with Cyclone Seroja in Kalbarri. We were just far too slow to respond. And Kalbarri, which is not a remote part of Western Australia, is still suffering.
And so on that note, Melissa Price, is now the time for Commonwealth and the state governments to be thinking about where are the emergency evacuation points and how to best ensure that those people living, as you identify, in very remote and isolated communities can get there and get the support that they're needed.
Yeah, absolutely. We can't wait. And often what happens with disasters, people say, well, let's just wait until the water recedes or the fires are out. But we can't do that in this situation because there are an incredibly large number of vulnerable people already living in those communities. So, as I say, I'm very happy that the ADF is now being called in, and I'm very much appreciated that. But, you know, we need to look at, well, how many ADF people have we got involved? I know that the Pilbara Regiment is just down the road, and North Force, which is also in the Kimberley. I would say as a starting point, both of those regiments need to be involved now.
And look, just finally, we've been hearing that the point you made about the confidence that comes when the Defence Force are involved. Members of the community yesterday, in reports that we were broadcasting here on the Newschannel, was saying they really wanted there to be essentially boots on the ground to start to coordinate that response. There is also going to be a conversation about Fitzroy Crossing in particular. The town, I understand, had been moved, and that many of the communities, the homes in the communities in the surrounding area are already on stilts. The water has reached above those, what were considered to be those safe areas. Have you started to turn your attention to what sort of precautions need to be put in place into the future?
Yeah, look, there's no doubt that the people in the Kimberley, people in the Fitzroy, this is not the first time that they've experienced significant weather, and you know that they have a wet season. That's why it's called the wet season. And obviously over the years they have determined what was going to be fit for purpose housing infrastructure. Well, I think what we've seen over the last few days is that it's not fit for purpose. So, you know, we need a very serious conversation, and this is state government turning its mind to what was the infrastructure that was there and was it fit for purpose? And that's just in the Fitzroy. That's not all those communities that are, you know, within the catchment area. So there is a big job ahead of us, and it is an emergency. And I just want to thank you, Dan, for giving me the opportunity to talk today, because I do feel that we are often forgotten about in the Kimberley. So I just want to appreciate that the ABC has turned its mind to this very important emergency that's unfolding today.
Well, certainly important. We've been covering it and we'll continue to do so, and appreciate your insights there, Melissa Price, Federal Member for the Electorate of Durack. Do keep us up to date of any updates you hear as well.
Good on you. Thanks a lot.
An Australian woman charged with entering Islamic State territory in 2014 has been granted bail by a New South Wales court. Reporter Leah Harris is following the story.
Mariam Raab applied for bail in Griffith Local Court this morning, and there is quite a high threshold for this type of offence to be granted bail, given that it is a terrorism offence. Now, she is accused of knowingly travelling to Syria willingly and knowing what her husband, Mohammed Zahab, was doing over there, being involved in Islamic State fighting. Now, the legislation dictates that she should not be given bail for this type of offence unless there are exceptional circumstances. So her defence team argued that her and her children, who were also over there in Syria with her, are all suffering from PTSD, and that her children are also suffering from physical effects of poor nutrition while they were living in Syria, and that they heavily rely on the support of their mother. They argued there is no evidence that she is an ongoing threat to the community and that she has strong ties to her community in Young. So she was granted strict conditional bail, and she will appear in court again in March.
Leah, what's been the response so far to those charges?
Well, the opposition has been critical of the repatriation of these women last year. She is one of 4 women who were brought over here with their children from Syria, repatriated in communities in Australia, and this has been their reaction to these charges yesterday.
We did not, and we do not believe that it is in our national interest to bring these ISIS brides back to Australia. When we were in government, we brought back some orphans, but that's a world away from what Labor did last year. The Labor government were warned extensively about the risks of their plan to bring back these people. They were warned by local mayors. They were warned by parliamentarians, not just the Liberals, but independents too.
So it remains to be seen what effect these charges will have on the people in Syria who are still hoping to be repatriated back here in Australia.
Lee Harris reporting. The 2022 Australian Population Report has been released in full, predicting how the country's demographics will shift over the next decade. Australia's population won't fully recover from the pandemic for at least another 10 years, leading to a country that is older and smaller. Political reporter Dana Morse has the latest from Parliament House.
The Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, says that the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on population and demographics is the single most significant influence that's been felt in Australia since Federation. Now, we know that Australia is on track to reach 29.9 million people by 2032. That's a longer timeline that had been previously forecasted. We'll also see the median age go up to 40 years old, and Melbourne will outstrip Sydney as the most populated city over the next decade. Looking at the impact of the pandemic, the death rate that was predicted to surge as a result of the pandemic actually hasn't moved too much at all. There has been a slight increase in the number of deaths in the last 12 months financial year as a result of the move to COVID policy that saw an increase in infections over the 2022 year, but that's expected to stabilise over the next couple of years and not have a lasting impact on population growth. We also heard plenty of anecdotal stories during the pandemic about a COVID baby boom, but that also failed to eventuate, with the birth rate remaining at about 1.6 births per Australian woman, and that's not forecast to increase particularly much over the next couple of years. So that means that the government is going to rely on migration in order to keep the population stable. This is an important report for the government because it informs forward planning and infrastructure spending in particular, and also points out where we can expect to see issues. We are seeing problems already at the moment with things around workforce shortages and skill gaps. That's something that's predicted to continue into the next decade and will inform a lot of the policies that we expect this government and future governments to bring forward. But now let's take a listen to the Federal Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, speaking about the population statement earlier this morning.
One of the most important things that we can do and that we are doing is to build the kind of workforce that can support a population which is getting bigger but also getting a bit older as well, and some of those trends have been exacerbated by COVID. So most of our efforts in this space, in addition to releasing this really fascinating set of data today from the Centre for Population and the work that my colleague Claire O'Neill and others are doing with our migration review, is to make sure we get those workforce settings right.
Dana, just how accurate are the predictions in this report?
Well, they're not infallible, Dan. The executive director of the Centre for Population wrote in his statement as part of the report that there were significant uncertainty around the projections for the future population, and that made the pandemic made it very difficult to analyse population trends. The Centre says it's used its professional judgment in its analysis and will continue to publish more developments as more data becomes available. But it goes to show that we can certainly expect some changes during the next data set that comes out with this report. It's an annual report, so we'll have to wait and see for the fourth instalment next year to see if this report is far off the mark at all. Dan?
Dana Morse reporting from Parliament. Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered a 36-hour ceasefire in Ukraine, the first in the 10-month-long conflict. But Kyiv has rejected the temporary truce, saying it's actually an attempt to stop Ukrainian military advances in the eastern Donbass region.
These soldiers aren't preparing for a ceasefire. They're readying for a new offensive. Ukraine fears an attack could be launched from Belarus in the coming months. This brigade is organising its defence. In Russia, preparations are underway to celebrate Christmas this weekend, observed on January 7 in the Eastern Orthodox faith. The head of Russia's Orthodox Church has justified and defended the war in Ukraine, but called on Vladimir Putin to cease fighting on the holy day. The president ordered his troops to lay down their weapons for 36 hours, starting at midday on January 6.
They may not shoot tomorrow specifically, but what difference does it make? They're going to carry on shooting the day after tomorrow.
Ukraine's Orthodox leaders this year moved away from Russian tradition, many marking Christmas on December 25 for the first time. But officials in Kyiv rejected the truce until all troops have left occupied territory.
Everyone in the world knows how the Kremlin uses respite in the war to continue the war with renewed vigour, and to end the war faster, something completely different is needed.
At the beginning of this conflict, Russia was constantly offering ceasefires and so-called humanitarian corridors to evacuate civilian populations from the areas of the fighting, but constantly using them as deceptions and traps to lure civilians into the open and then shell them or abduct them.
World leaders say this is no turning point in the war. Germany and the US are vowing to send the country more war machines.
He was ready to bomb hospitals and nurseries and churches on the 25th and New Year's. And I mean, you know, I think he's trying to find some oxygen.
These troops are betting there will be no break on the battlefield. Isabella Higgins, ABC News.
The US House of Representatives has adjourned for a third straight day without a speaker after Republicans again failed to elect someone to the position. Californian Kevin McCarthy has now lost 11 rounds of voting, but is still refusing to back down. North America correspondent Jade McMillan joins me now from Washington, D.C. Jade, what is Mr McCarthy saying about where this could go from here?
Well, Kevin McCarthy remains defiant despite losing another 5 ballots today. That is 11 rounds of voting in total. He insists that progress is being made, that talks are taking place behind the scenes with this core group of detractors who have so far refused to back Mr McCarthy for the position of Speaker. He has defended a new round of concessions that he has offered to them, including one that would make it easier for any member in the House of Representatives to bring on a vote that could ultimately remove him from the job. He says that he isn't putting any timeframes on this, that members will come back tomorrow. That is when we expect a 12th round to get underway, and that he says that he's not tying himself to any particular timeline, that he'll fight it out for as long as it takes.
Jade, I'll ask you to look into the crystal ball. How long could this take to sort out?
Well, no one knows at this point. There are no limits here. In fact, members have to keep voting until they elect a speaker. The longest that this has ever taken was back in 1856 when they spent 2 months and 133 ballots to settle on someone. Everyone is hoping, most people I think would be hoping, that we don't get anywhere near that record this time around, but there is still so much uncertainty here. And more broadly, the longer that this goes on for, the longer that the House of Representatives is effectively left in limbo. It cannot move on with any other business until this position is filled. It means that members haven't even been formally sworn in yet. And for those that are set to serve on committees, particularly when it comes to national security-related committees, they say that they haven't been able to receive the classified briefings that they normally would be as part part of that work. So a lot of Republicans now raising serious concerns as frustration grows as this saga drags on. And either way, when we finally do get someone elected to that position, this has raised serious questions about the party's ability to govern in the House of Representatives for the next 2 years with a small majority.
Jade McMillan reporting from Washington, D.C. Critics have labelled a proposal by Israel's new government to weaken the Supreme Court an assault on democracy. It follows the return last month of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as leader of a new hard-right government. Middle East correspondent Tom Joyner has more.
It's only been in power for a week, but Israel's new government isn't wasting any time. Led by Prime Minister, political veteran Benjamin Netanyahu, the new government includes ministers from what had previously been considered the extreme right fringe of Israeli politics. Mr Netanyahu, who himself faces trial for corruption, has had to corral a new cabinet that includes in its ranks convicted criminals. There's the new National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, a West Bank settler who's previously been convicted for racist incitement and supporting terrorists. His visit to a Jerusalem holy site for Muslims this week has drawn intense condemnation and is expected to be the subject of an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council in the next 24 hours. Then there's the Health Minister, Aryeh Deri, who last year was convicted of tax fraud. His appointment to Cabinet faces appeal in the Supreme Court, but the government is pushing on. This week, Justice Minister Yariv Levin unveiled the government's plan for overhaul of Israel's judiciary. The proposal is aimed to weaken the Supreme Court's influence on the government by giving the parliament the power to override the court's decisions with a simple majority. Critics of that plan say it will undermine Israel's democracy, concentrate power in the new executive, and risk greater infringement of minority rights. A crowd of hundreds of anti-government protesters shut down traffic as they gathered outside the Supreme Court on Thursday.
We came here to protest the corruption of the Israeli government. We don't agree that a criminal will be appointed to be a minister. We are fighting also all the new laws that are going to pass and actually cancel all democracy that is today and weaken the Supreme Court.
The proposed changes to the judiciary will next face debate in the parliament before the likelihood of a preliminary vote before the end of the month. More protests opposing the proposed changes are also expected in other parts of the country.
It was supposed to be kept under lock and key until its release next week, but Prince Harry's new book has already gone on sale in Spain. In it, he accuses Prince William of physically attacking him, describing him as both a brother and an arch-nemesis. He also accuses Camilla of leaking to the press and says he begged his father not to marry her.
They may have looked like a happy family, but neither William nor Harry pretended their relationship was perfect.
Do you ever have disagreements about things?
Oh, yes. Harry claims just 1 year later his brother physically attacked him in a cottage behind Kensington Palace. William had called Meghan rude and abrasive, he said. He grabbed me by the collar, ripping my necklace, and he knocked me to the floor. I landed on the dog's bowl, which cracked under my back, the pieces cutting into me. It's just one of the allegations in the Prince's new book, which has somehow found its way onto shelves in Spain. He also claims William and Kate actively encouraged him to go to a party in 2005 dressed as a Nazi. He says William's been both his beloved brother and his arch nemesis.
There has always been this competition between us. Weirdly. I think it really plays into, or is played by, the heir spare.
Harry also writes about his cocaine use, saying he wanted to feel like someone else. He reveals he killed 25 Taliban fighters in Afghanistan, feeling neither pride nor shame. He says he's driven repeatedly through the Paris tunnel where his mother lay dying, and says he's communicated with her from beyond the grave. Both he and William begged his father not to marry Camilla, he says, and while he believes she makes him happy, he's accused the Queen Consort of leaking stories to the press. The royal family might have been hoping this book was just another rehash of the Sussexes' already well-publicised grievances, but the allegations Prince Harry's put in print are potentially far more damaging. They attack the character of the King-in-Waiting, the man upon whom the monarchy's very future rests.
If you're invited to the coronation, will you come?
There's a lot that can happen between now and then, but, you know, the door is always open. The ball is in their court.
The family isn't commenting publicly for now, but the chances of healing this royal rift look to be getting slimmer by the day. Nick Dole, ABC News, London.
World-renowned Australian fashion designer and artist Jenny Key is among the many creatives behind this year's Sydney Festival. Her contribution, titled The Aunties, takes the form of a playful pair of inflated characters. Lara Heim spoke to her about the artwork.
She's synonymous with some of Australia's biggest names in fashion and designs, and now her next chapter is going to be focusing on larger-than-life installations. I am, of course, talking to Jenny Key, who is the creator of The Aunties, a new piece which is coming up for the Sydney Festival. Jenny, welcome.
Hi.
You're now creating these huge inflatables, really, that are going to be on display as part of the Sydney Festival. Where did you get this idea?
Well, there's always a first. And the whole idea of having 2 5-metre amorphic shapes amongst the trees is such a wonderful fantasy.
And so these pieces have a unique design which you have created. Tell us about this print.
This is another version of the print, which is a 40-odd-year-old print that I did called Uni Oz. I wanted to design a stripe, like a fair old stripe in a knit, that was iconic, full of colour. And so I created this Uni Oz stripe with Kanga Kuka Koala, Waratah, Uluru, the Opera House, all these images in one design. And what a wonderful way to use it, and to have these huge amorphic shapes that are actually inflatables, but then there's the idea of the knitting pattern in these inflatables. I just love that. That's an extra dimension to it that's so exciting.
I just wanted to focus on the title of the piece. It's called The Aunties, and it's really paying tribute to 2 characters in your life, your aunties. What was your relationship with them, and how have they inspired your artistic journey?
Look, there was Mum, and then were her sisters, and they were my aunties, and they worked in the shop with me. I mean, my first auntie, Una, she was the most extraordinary couture sewer, Italian couture sewer. And then Auntie Marge was equally a beautiful sewer, who always felt she was less than because she didn't sew couture. But they both worked in the shop with my mum and me. It was a really wonderful family concern, Flamingo Park. And to honour them in this way, it's just, for me, it's history, you know. It's wonderful. I mean, I'm entering my 76th year. The shop opened in 1973, where this is 50 years on. So it's just, you know, family is so important to me, and to be able to do this iconic design, which is over 40 years old, 50 years later, in, you know, and honouring, you know, members of my family, it's just, doesn't get any better. Swaying in the trees.
So Jenny, just to pick up on that, you mentioned about your family and family as a concept. How significant is that in your artwork?
Well, look, there was a Chinese father, there was an Italian, Aussie mum, an Aussie that came out in the 1797. I'm a 7th generation. 1/4 of me is 7th generation white Australian. So I think that has shaped, being born here, being born at Bondi, I think that has actually shaped my colour and joy and optimism and design.
And you're also giving a talk about these pieces too, aren't you?
I'm giving an artist talk, which will be about my life and how I came to be an artist. So it's going to be a really, I think, an exciting talk, because once I start, you can never shut me up, and I always seem to talk about things that you're not meant to talk about because I'm not politically correct.
Time to have a look at the weather now. Here's Emma Rebelato.
Let's start with the satellite picture and that thick cloud across the north with ex-tropical cyclone Ellie and a monsoon trough are bringing a lot of rain, gusty winds and storms, while a trough with a cool change is pushing over New South Wales, and that's causing showers and the odd storm through there. But WA will again see intense rainfall and damaging winds before that system moves southeast over the border into the NT. So that will happen over the weekend. It'll bring heavy falls to already sodden areas in the Territory, and it's prompted an initial flood watch for parts of the NT before that system starts to weaken. Let's take a look at tomorrow's forecast now. Brisbane's expecting a partly cloudy day tomorrow with a top of 29. Sydney a shower or two, 24. Canberra is looking at a partly cloudy top of 23 degrees. Melbourne is warming up to 30, a sunny day there. Hobart partly cloudy, 23. Adelaide sunny and a very warm 36 degrees. Perth mostly sunny, 29. And for Darwin a shower or two and possible storm with 32 degrees.
You can keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on ABC iView. Here are the top stories on ABC News. Evacuations are continuing from isolated communities across WA's Kimberley region due to flooding that's been described as the worst in the state's history. Efforts to supply food and medical resources continue to be impacted by severe weather conditions. WA's emergency services will attempt to access the tourist town of Broome today after the extreme weather forced an ADF plane to be diverted. A woman charged with a terrorism offence has been granted bail. Mariam Raad faced Griffith Local Court in New South Wales this morning, charged with entering or remaining in an area controlled by the Islamic State terrorist group in 2014. The 31-year-old applied for bail based on exceptional circumstances, telling the court she and her children suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder because of their time in Syria. The US House of Representatives has adjourned without a speaker for a third day after Republicans again failed to elect anyone to the role. Frontrunner Kevin McCarthy has now failed 11 times to win over a group of Conservatives who oppose his bid. The House has been adjourned until tomorrow with no sign of consensus. Copies of Prince Harry's new book have gone on sale early in Spain, detailing a series of allegations against members of the royal family. Among them are details of a physical altercation with his brother Prince William. He also claims he begged his father, the King, not to marry Camilla because accusing her of leaking to the press. Let's get more now on the emergency situation in the Kimberley. Keith Williams is the Community Development Director at the Shire of Broome. He says the weather is improving, allowing crews to assess the damage.
Things have eased in Broome. There's still a lot of issues in Fitzroy Crossing and downstream from the crossing. But in Broome, the weather outside is actually pretty dry and the wind has dropped off. So we're just assessing all the damage that's been done over the last few days.
Well, let's go through those first, and we'll start with Broome. What's your assessment of the damage that's been done?
We've got off pretty lightly. There's been 2 or 3 homes that have had trees on their roofs, but no real structural damage or damage to their integrity. So lots of drainage issues and flooding, local flooding. But overall, the water's drained away pretty quickly. Most of the drains have handled the water pretty well. The last 3 days, we've had somewhere near 600 millimetres of rain, but that's all drained away pretty quickly, and the rain's been nice and consistent, so it hasn't caused any major problems.
Keith, as you mentioned, it's a very different story for Fitzroy Crossing. What's the latest you can tell us about the situation there?
We've got an update at midday, so I can't tell you too much, but I know that the Fitzroy Crossing is dropping. There's still evacuations being taken place there. There's still issues with evacuation centres and getting supplies to people. Broome is now cut off. About an hour ago, we got cut off from the south, so the highway is closed. The highway is also closed to Halls Creek, so Derby and Fitzroy are isolated. Broome's now isolated, so the next big issue will be getting supplies into all of the local communities. And I do understand that. Sorry,
please go on.
Arrangements for supplies.
Based on that, I wonder if you can expand on what the preparations are and what measures are in place, particularly around supplies and food security.
So supplies will be handled by DFES, and they're making arrangements for permits for vehicles to travel through the floodwaters. The Roebuck Plains is the area that's flooded. It's relatively long and shallow, so vehicles over 500 millimetres can get through. So they'll issue permits for trucks to get through the highway, bringing supplies. If the closures go on longer than a couple of weeks, in the past there's been barges from Bidjidanga to Broome to provide supplies. Supplies to the East Kimberley will come through the Northern Territory. So I'm confident that all arrangements that are in place will make sure that we have the resources that we need.
And Keith, as well as those major centres that you've mentioned, there are also lots of much smaller and more remote Indigenous communities there. Do you have a sense of how they're faring?
Well, in the Shire of Broome, we've been in contact with those local communities, and they're all faring fairly well up the Dampity Peninsula. We've had regular contact with those smaller communities, and they've had lots of rain and a bit of wind and a few trees down, but similar weather conditions to what we've had here in Broome, and they're coping quite well. They have fuel supplies and food supplies to keep them functioning. The highway or the road to those communities is still open, so if we do need to get supplies to them, we can. But at this stage, they've probably received a little bit less rain than Broome and a little bit less wind than Broome, so they're coping quite well. And we do have regular contact with them, so we'll keep monitoring those communities to make sure that they've got everything they need.
Keith, at this stage, it certainly seems as though that weather condition is pushing more and more inland towards the Northern Territory border. Are you expecting further rain for particular areas, and what advice are you giving when community members are getting in touch?
Well, we refer people to Emergency WA, which is the official response channel for emergencies, where the local government has a role to play, but certainly people should be contacting Emergency WA or DFES if they have any concerns. We're not expecting too much more from the weather system. The area that it's going to traverse through till it gets to the WA border is relatively sparsely populated. DFES obviously will be in touch with communities like Balgo to make sure that they're safe, but the monsoon trough that was feeding this weather system is also dissipating, so we don't expect too much more, or the advice we're being given is that there's not an expectation that there'll be too much more weather coming from the system.
Well, we certainly hope that remains the case. Keith, thanks so much for joining us. Keith Williams, the Community Development Director at the Shire of Broome.
No problem, thanks.
Experts in South Australia are investigating whether dead marine life that's washed up near the mouth of the River Murray is linked to the flooding. Evelyn Mansfield reports from Port Elliot.
Dan, there's sea cucumbers, starfish, blue ring octopus. There's all sorts of marine life that have washed up here on the sand at Port Elliot, and there's hundreds if not thousands of dead sea creatures here, and this is because it's near the mouth of the River Murray, and of course as the water flows down the River Murray it's collecting all sediment and rubbish and turning some of the water here quite brown, and locals have said today to us that they've never seen anything like this. They've never seen this amount of marine life dead washed up here. Now, officers from the Department of Primary Industries are doing some testing to see, what could possibly be causing this, looking for diseases if that could be causing it, and they're also doing water samples to see if it could be an algae issue. So very much still investigating what's causing this. One expert today also said that it could be because of all the fresh water. Some of these marine life aren't used to all the fresh water. But as for locals, they've never seen anything like this and commented on just how catastrophic it is. Take a listen to one of the locals we spoke to earlier.
It's absolutely and utterly catastrophic. The impact that we're having on the environment in every way one can possibly think about, and particularly with organisms of this sort, which are very delicate and subject to rapid changes in pH or chemical composition of the water. And it's an event that's unique.
And in terms of the peak at the River Murray further upstream, Evelyn, where's that at?
Yeah, so about 2 days ago it was in Morgan, and then today is heading towards Mannum. So between today and the next 3 days in Mannum, and then after that Murray Bridge and the lower lakes. So certainly the sort of bottom part of the River Murray is yet to see the peak yet, and that'll continue to flow through. The state government yesterday said it is moving a little bit quicker than expected, so they've moved those peak days forward by about a day. So some of the locals with that in mind that we've spoken to today said, you know, how's that going to impact on the marine life here, and saying that as more water and sediment and rubbish continues to flow downstream, perhaps we'll see even more dead marine life here.
Victorian police investigating a crash that killed 4 people in the state's north say it's likely the victims were not wearing seatbelts. Reporter Stephanie Ferrier has more from Melbourne.
We've been hearing from the Acting Assistant Commissioner of Police here, Justin Goldsmith, and he says the scene was devastating and incredibly confronting, even for seasoned crash investigators. And he also says that 3 of the 4 passengers in the hatchback were ejected after that vehicle crashed with a 4-wheel drive ute in a T-bone collision just outside of Shepparton. And he says that people aren't normally thrown from a vehicle like that when they are wearing their seatbelts. So it is likely that this trio weren't wearing their seatbelts, and he says that he can't stress enough the importance of that key safety measure. We do know that the 29-year-old driver of the 4-wheel drive ute suffered minor injuries and is expected to be discharged from the Goulburn Valley Hospital today. And the driver of the hatchback, a man aged in his 40s who police say is very lucky to be alive, underwent surgery in Melbourne yesterday. Detectives from the Major Collision Investigation Unit are obviously very keen to be able to speak to both drivers just to try to piece together exactly what happened in this crash and what caused it. We know that it's a 100 km/h zone, so it would have been a very high speed crash. And the police want to know whether or not the hatchback went through that stop sign before being collected by the 4-wheel drive ute. Now, we also know that this particular intersection was the scene of a very serious crash just early last month as well. And the Minister here for Roads and Road Safety, Ben Carroll, says that they will be looking at this intersection to see if anything can be done to make it safer.
It's been an endless and detrimental waiting game for thalidomide survivors across Australia. After a Senate inquiry found the government had a moral obligation towards them in 2019, they say little progress has been made and time is running out.
With each passing year, ageing thalidomide survivors fear they may not live to hear the government say sorry.
We're just deteriorating so fast. Yeah, I've just gone really downhill in the last 6 months.
Thalidomide was a morning sickness drug that led to birth deformities in around 10,000 babies worldwide in the 1950s and 60s.
The government created our disability by allowing the drug to be sold here when they knew that it caused birth deformities.
The government committed to an apology and a national memorial in its response to a 2019 Senate inquiry that was driven by fellow survivor Lisa McManus.
There was feelings of victory, validation that everything that we'd been presenting to the government for all these years had finally been heard and recognised.
But 4 years on, survivors are still waiting for the government to fulfil its promises.
The apology is not going to fix everything, but it's verification that they did wrong.
Due to COVID restrictions, the Federal Health Department has delayed the apology. It says it's working on arrangements with the Prime Minister, Cabinet and survivors to have it delivered this year. The department says it may coincide with the dedication of the memorial, which is set to be completed in the second half of 2023. With a new government in power, survivors are hoping it can accomplish what past administrations have failed to do.
I don't think it's unreasonable just to say that we want a supportive government.
I don't know how many parents and survivors have died waiting for that apology.
Sarah Richards, ABC News.
Republicans in the US House of Representatives have failed to elect a speaker after 3 days of repeated voting. Former Republican Congresswoman Barbara Comstock says the impasse outlines divisions within the party.
Many of the very same people, Matt Gaetz,
Lauren Boebert, the people who were, at the forefront of January 6th and the insurrection are now doing this very same thing again. They refused to accept the will of the people in November of 2020, and now within their own party, they are leading an insurrection, and a very small minority of them, 28 out of 222, are refusing to accept the will of their own party and picking their leaders. So these are people who have no respect for the institutions. They're members, by and large, who have never, many of them have never passed bills, usually don't vote for just having the government open, functioning, having budgets. So it's very destructive. And at a time when we really need to be responding to the American people, they are putting a very bad face on the Republican Party. This type of debacle is once again showing how Trump has been so disastrous to Republicans. He caused Republicans to lose the midterms in a large way in 18, lose again in 20, when he didn't win re-election. And now in 22, we lost the Senate. Republicans lost the Senate again because of his many flawed candidates he endorsed, and came in narrowly into the House. And now Trumpism is causing this debacle.
At least 3 people have been killed in Mexico after the arrest of one of the nation's most wanted men. Authorities have captured Ovidio Guzman, the son of notorious drug lord known as El Chapo. It's prompted a furious response from the Sinaloa cartel. Roads have been blocked by burning vehicles, while army helicopters and police aeroplanes have come under fire. Ovidio Guzman, known by the nickname The Mouse, was arrested in 2019, but later freed when cartel gunmen overwhelmed security forces. US authorities say they're monitoring the situation.
Our embassy in Mexico City published an alert to US citizens today advising that the Sinaloan governor has called for the public to shelter in place. We have advised US citizens in Sinaloa to remain alert for potential violence throughout the state.
Tens of thousands of mourners have gathered at the Vatican for the funeral of the former Pope Benedict, who died on New Year's Eve. Benedict had been the first pontiff to retire since the Middle Ages. The service in St. Peter's Square was conducted by the current Pope Francis.
Before the largest church in all Christendom, in front of a crowd of 50,000, he was brought for one final time to spontaneous applause. It was, of course, the last occasion the two popes were together, one presiding over the funeral of the other. During his homily, Pope Francis used biblical references in which he appeared to compare Benedict to Jesus.
We want to do this with the same wisdom, tenderness and devotion that he bestowed on us over the years. Together we want to say, Father, into your hands we commend his spirit.
In the crowd were an estimated 4,000 members of the clergy, and many who admired the Pope Emeritus as a theologian and intellectual. Although, of course, Pope Benedict stepped down long before he died, a lot of the rituals, a lot of the liturgy are those that we've seen over the ages of papal deaths. Unusually, though, at this funeral, prayers are being said for both the previous Pope and the incumbent one. There was a final farewell blessing. Inside the coffin with Pope Benedict, a deed detailing his achievements. It included a line about his role in tackling abuse. That's upset many of his critics. But as the service ended, others chanted that Benedict should immediately be made a saint. Away from public gaze in a crypt, cardinals accompanied him in burial.
Many of the cardinals who were here were a bit on the older side and will have known him intimately. And so there was a kind of final salute, which it was a privilege for me to be part of.
The 265th Pope, over 2,000 years, Benedict XVI, in the resting place he chose for himself.
US actor Edward Norton has discovered he's the direct descendant of historical Native American figure Pocahontas. Records on the show Finding Your Roots have confirmed the 17th century heroine is the 12th great-grandmother of Norton. The daughter of Powhatan chief Pocahontas welcomed British settlers to present-day Virginia in the early 1600s. She married Englishman John Rolfe in 1614 and they had a son Thomas a year later. Tens of thousands of car lovers from across the country have made their way to Canberra for the Summer Nats Car Festival. After 2 COVID-affected years, people from interstate and overseas are being welcomed back to the annual 4-day event. Reporter Chantal Alcuri is at Exhibition Park.
I'm standing in front of one of 60 of the best Summer Nats cars this year. It's one of the 2,700 that have been registered this year, a record for the festival since it started in 1988. And one of those people is Carolyn Hayes. Carolyn, what can you tell us about the car behind us?
It's a 1975 model LH Tirana. I brought it in 2016, brought it home, and my husband and I pulled it apart and rebuilt it, top to bottom.
And what was that process like? I'm sure you kept working on it during the pandemic and you finally get to show it off.
Yeah, we spent many hours right through the COVID break in the shed building it, but also even in the last couple of years, it's just been non-stop to get it here this weekend. It doesn't matter how long ago you started, it always seems to be a rush at the end.
And what's the appeal of the Summer Nats Festival for you to come every year?
I think it's just a place where people, that do this for a hobby and for a living can just enjoy other people's work, their own work, and just show everybody what we've been doing and what we love.
And there will be plenty more cars like this to see roaming around the city until this Sunday.
A sculpture of one of Australia's most celebrated women's cricketers has been unveiled at the SCG. The bronze sculpture of Belinda Clark recognises her contribution to the sport, having led Australia at 3 World Cups and becoming the first to make a double century in a one-day international against India in 1997. She says she's proud to represent a chapter in women's sport.
It's been a really interesting journey, but I think Kathy Wiseman, who is the sculptor, she did an amazing job and I'm really thrilled with the outcome. I feel like I'm really sort of representing a tribe of people who have gone before me and those that are playing the game now, doing amazing things to make sure the sport's open and inclusive, and it's just, I think, recognition of how far cricket's come, and I'm really thrilled with the outcome, and it's great that it's in just such a prominent place at the SCG, and you can hear the food going back behind me there, but it's going to be a busy day here at the SCG today. The sport in all has changed. I think T20 cricket has done that to both the men's and women's game, and it's just wonderful now that there's opportunities for girls to be playing club cricket. The entry-level programs in Woolworths Cricket Blast have a lot of girls sort of in them now, which wasn't the case when I was growing up. So lots more opportunities, lots more visible, and great opportunities to watch great international cricket with our superstar female players on the televisions and on radios throughout the summer.
Play is yet to begin on day 3 of the 3rd test against South Africa due to heavy rain. Here's Simon Smale.
There's nothing more frustrating for cricket fans than seeing the covers on the pitch, and unfortunately it's a sight that we've got all too used to seeing over the course of the last few years at the Sydney Test. In fact, only 1 year in the last 8 have we had an uninterrupted Test match at the SCG. And it's all the more disappointing because it's Jane McGrath Day at the SCG today on day 3, where funds are raised to help support breast cancer nurses across the country. So very disappointing. That ceremony, the pre-match, or pre-day's play ceremony, I should say, has actually been postponed until tomorrow, which should give us a bit of an indication that they don't think there's going to be much chance of play. But we are still holding out a little bit of hope that we might get an hour or two later on this afternoon.
Yeah, and Usman Khawaja is on 195 runs. Is there going to be a chance for him to reach his maiden double Test century?
Well, you'd certainly hope so. He's on 195. He's had such a great return to the Australian Test team. It started last year at the SCG when he made a century in each innings. He could double up in the first innings here, just 5 runs away. If he does do so, it will be the first time in Test cricket history in Australia that 4 different batters will have scored 200 over the course of a summer. However, with the match situation, you do wonder whether or not Pat Cummins will opt to declare and leave him stranded on 195, which would be hugely disappointing. But I have a feeling that Australia may well do that, particularly if they can't get any play in today.
Well, Simon, let's look to tomorrow. The forecast is better. Is there a chance of getting a result in the match?
Well, you'd certainly think so. South Africa have been very disappointing over the course of the Test match. So they've only passed 200 as a team once. I don't expect they'll be able to do that on a wearing SCG pitch either. So with 2 days, if we get all 2 days play in, then Australia should have a really good opportunity to bowl them out twice. The only possible obstruction to that will be the fact that there is the potential for more rain. We'll just keep our fingers crossed, but you never know. Fingers crossed we'll get a result and Australia will complete a perfect Test summer.
Yeah, indeed. Simon Smale reporting. A rare corpse flower will bloom this weekend in Adelaide, a noxious event that only takes place once every 10 years. Charles Bryce is at the South Australian Botanic Gardens.
People who are visiting the Adelaide Botanic Gardens over the weekend may get a little bit more than what they bargained for. This corpse flower behind me is set to bloom within the next 24 hours. Now, it might be nice on the eye, but it is a completely different story when it comes to the nose. The plant is native to the Indonesian island of Sumatra. It is endangered, mainly due to deforestation, which is why it can be found across botanic gardens right across the world. It is rare for these plants to flower. It takes 10 years for it to first flower. When it flowers, it absolutely stinks. It's likened to rotting flesh, dead rats or off cheese. The flowering only lasts for 48 hours. It is its most mephitic within the first 24 hours. Probably not one to buy for your partner this Valentine's Day.
Time for a look at the weather now. Here's Emma Revelato.
Let's start with the satellite picture and that thick cloud across the north with ex-tropical cyclone Ellie and a monsoon trough are bringing a lot of rain, gusty winds and storms, while a trough with a cool change is pushing over New South Wales and that's causing showers and the odd storm through there. But WA will again see intense rainfall and damaging winds before that system moves southeast over the border into the NT. So that will happen over the weekend. It'll bring heavy falls to already sodden areas in the Territory, and it's prompted an initial flood watch for parts of the NT before that system starts to weaken. Let's take a look at tomorrow's forecast now. Brisbane's expecting a partly cloudy day tomorrow with a top of 29. Sydney a shower or two, 24. Canberra is looking at a partly cloudy top of 23 degrees. Melbourne is warming up to 30, a sunny day there. Hobart partly cloudy, 23. Adelaide sunny and a very warm 36 degrees. Perth mostly sunny, 29. And for Darwin a shower or two and possible storm with 32 degrees.
And that's ABC News for now. A reminder, you can keep up to date on all the latest news across all your devices at news.abc.net.au and on ABC iView. I'm Dan Borscher. Thanks for your company.